Okay, so it's 10 o'clock. Thank you all who are attending. Today I have the pleasure of introducing Jarrett Lovell, who is a professor of politics, administration, and justice at Cal State University, Fullerton. He earned his undergrad degree at the University of California, Irvine, and he graduated with honors in psychology. His master's and doctorate degree in criminal justice from Rutgers University. And among his teaching and research interests are animals as victims, civil disobedience and nonviolent protests, and theories of social justice. He also leads the Humanities and Social Sciences Study Abroad program in South Africa, where he and his students perform service learning at a sanctuary for lions rescued from the illegal international pet trade and the canned trophy hunting industry. He is the author of 2 books, as well as several articles in peer-reviewed journals. His most recent research focuses on the largely overlooked occurrence of farm animal abuse. His latest publication is a commentary appearing in the journal Animal Sentience, calling for animal rights advocates to demand safer and more just working conditions for those who harvest the ingredients for plants diet. So I'm not sure if that's
Diets, yeah.
okay. When not working, he hosts a weekly radio show where he spins Jamaican, African, and American jazz. He lives in Long Beach with his girlfriend and adopted cat, Tibby. All right, Jarrett, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be able to feel part of the Fullerton community once again. Despite COVID, I really miss interacting with students and colleagues and the broader Cal State Fullerton community. So this is a pleasure and an honor. My talk today is kind of a primer of my seminar course titled Animals, Law, and Society. So we're going to be covering a lot of different issues in a really short time. So this is a kind of a primer of my seminar course that takes a look at a whole host of issues. I'll try to leave as much time as possible for Q&A because I find that tends to be the most interesting. But let us get started by trying to solve a mystery. Who murdered the mountain gorillas? It was a very straightforward question, but it didn't have quite a straightforward answer. But in July 2008, National Geographic set out to solve this mystery that, at least for a short time, captured the world's attention. Now, the gorillas in question were the Rugendo gorillas, literally a family of 18 silverback gorillas that lived in the heart of Virunga National Park. Virunga National Park, you may know, is located in an active war zone. It lies on the border of Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And this created many, many suspects in the mystery of who murdered the mountain gorillas. The area has various political factions vying for power. The area is also poor, yet resource rich. And so you had various militias, 2 separate militias, as well as the Congolese army that were vying for power and trying to seize control of the area to gain control of the resources. Here is Sankwekwe, the patriarch of this family of 18. What's interesting about the silverback gorillas, aside from their majesty, there are only 720 silverback gorillas left in the world. And so people from all over would travel to Virunga National Park on safari with the hope of being able to capture a glimpse of these beautiful and increasingly rare animals. Whoops. And they usually do. The animals are very friendly. The animals are very accustomed to the villagers. And so it was not uncommon to be able to travel all the way to the area and in fact, catch a glimpse of the animals. And therefore, Senkwekwe and the other Rugendos were internationally known, and they were certainly beloved. So villagers, as well as the international community, were in shock when in July 2007, photographs of Senkwekwe and his family having been gunned down were published by a journalist, Brett Sternton, and the images went around the world and certainly shocked the international community. In July 2007, park rangers found 3 members of the Rugendo family shot to death. The following day, another gorilla was found, and the gorilla was reportedly shot through the chest. Weeks later, the body of yet more gorillas was found. One, an infant gorilla shot dead. The other, a female gorilla, was shot in the back of the head, execution style. So this was clearly a message that someone was being sent. Her infant baby was still alive, still clinging to her mother. And images of the Rugendo gorillas being respectfully treated and given a proper ceremonial burial certainly went around the world. And the case of the Rugendos captured the public's imagination, if for a little bit. People were shocked not only by what happened to the gorillas, but more so that the gorillas apparently were pawns in a resource war. And the killing of the Rugendos was a way to send a message to one of the rival factions, as well as to block a source of revenue for that political faction. But it wasn't just the killing of the Rugendo gorillas that sparked international outrage. Apparently, how National Geographic reported the story also shocked the international community, or at least a large section of National Geographic readers. And the controversy about how National Geographic reported on the Rugendo gorillas all came down to just one word. And it was use of the word murder to describe what happened to these gorillas. National Geographic received many letters to the editor, and so I will share with you some of the letters as it starts as a jumping off point for our discussion of animals, law, and society. One reader wrote in saying, to use the word murder to describe the killing of animals is troubling. The word should be reserved for people, emphasis added. Using the word outside of its definition minimizes its meaning by equating people to animals. Never mind that people are animals, just a different species of animal. Nonetheless, this reader was outraged. A second reader wrote in saying, regardless of how you feel toward animals, the murder of millions of people in Darfur and other regions is a far greater crime. Now, what's interesting about this reader is that the reader acknowledges, whether the reader realizes it or not, that a crime has occurred against these mountain gorillas that are wild. Unfortunately, the reader doesn't specify, if it isn't murder, then exactly what was the crime that can be applied to what happened to these mountain gorillas. It doesn't seem to go far enough to call it animal abuse or animal cruelty. But here, the use of the word should be limited to humans. And interestingly, that there should be a priority of our empathy toward humans. One reader worried that we're slowly being desensitized to the killing of humans every time animals are elevated to our level. The argument here is that somehow by caring about animals, we will care less about humans, where, as we will see later in the presentation, it is the opposite that is true. Lack of concern and care for animals actually desensitizes us to the killing of humans. Still another reader suggested that empathy is a zero-sum game. I was even more concerned about the plight of the poor, hungry human beings who have to steal wood from the park in order to boil their water. The plight of these humans should be our very first concern. Again, the implication that empathy is a zero-sum game. If we care about what happens to animals, we cannot simultaneously care about what happens to humans. But not all of the letters criticize National Geographic for use of the word murder. One reader wrote in and said, "Thank you for correctly calling the tragic killing of these gorillas murder. These creatures are so closely related to human beings," that typo, "that the differences are irrelevant." Now, the reader here is well-intentioned, though there's something disquieting about having more consideration for beings that more closely resemble us and less consideration for beings perceived as different from us. History has taught us that tragic mistake. And so the purpose of my class, when I read that National Geographic, and more importantly, read the letters to the editor. In fact, I didn't quite see the actual issue of National Geographic. I was in a doctor's office waiting for the doctor, and the doctor had a copy of the 2000, the following weeks or months National Geographic. And I remember reading the letters to the editor, and everybody was all up in arms about use of the word murder to describe animals. And as a longtime animal rights activist and admitted vegan, I was so curious about what was so outrageous about use of the word murder to describe what happened to the Rugendo family. And I decided to form a class around that basic idea. That is, what if we take the language of the National Geographic headline seriously? What if we try to apply the word murder and other legal protections to animals? And I came up with 3 bullet points, 3 objectives for the course. The first is that when we study animals, we have to begin by questioning the meaning or the notion of the word rights. What is a right? Who or what is deserving of rights? And what does it mean when we claim a right? We are all thinking about rights a lot more these days, but few of us ever interrogate the meaning of the word and where our claim to rights actually comes from. And so I thought that that's an interesting point. Why not provide animals with the same legal protections or similar legal protections? Secondly, by studying animals, we better understand the human condition. One of the things we learn is the more we take a look at our relationships with animals, we begin to get a better sense of our biases and our contradictions and our moral dilemmas. And then finally, by studying animals, we examine issues of gender, race, class, and power in society. And that's something that is certainly surprising to students. They enroll in a class on animals and emerge from the class realizing that they've learned an awful lot more, perhaps about human behavior than animal behavior. And so what I want to do today is go through as much as I can in the limited time, examples of the 3 different learning objectives that the class provides. So let's start with a question about rights. What is a right? Who or what is deserving of a right? And what does it mean to claim a right? And so in order to do so, let us travel back in time to the year 1386, and we'll travel to a small village in France. I'll tell you a story of an infamous case. It was one of the crimes of the year, much talked about. In this year, 1386, in a small village in France, a female was accused of the crime of infanticide. In particular, she was accused of killing a baby by mangling its face and arms, thereby causing the baby's death. The defendant was brought in front of a court, given a trial. Evidence was heard against her. After the formal proceedings, she was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging in a public square. Now, this famous case of infanticide is famous for largely one reason. The defendant was a pig. In fact, for centuries, animals were criminally prosecuted and, if found guilty, received the punishment of the death penalty. Animal trials and executions have been a part of Western justice for centuries, and both the public and the courts took these proceedings seriously. The courts adhered to the same rules that apply to humans. Each animal was appointed defense counsel at the public's expense. The animals were housed in jail cells alongside human defendants. Courts appointed professional hangmen for executions, just as they did for human executions. And between the 9th and 20th centuries, there is historical documentation of some 191 prosecutions of animals. And so here we see that famous pig put on trial for infanticide. Here's a cat that was put on trial. I don't remember the precise nature of the crime that this cat was accused of. And as a cat person, I find this depiction horrific. Some of the cases were just extraordinary. And interestingly, some of the animals won their cases. So they weren't all simply executed. And so the fact that the animals were able to win some of their cases proves, or suggests at least, that the trials were not simply for show, but were instead taken seriously. My favorite case, a group of rats was charged with destroying barley crops in a village. The rats failed to appear for their court date. I'm not making this up. This is all a historical record. The rats failed to appear for their court date, and their lawyer made the case. The lawyer asked the judge, well, Your Honor, how many summonses did you send out for the rats to appear in court? When the judge said that he only sent out one summons, the attorney on behalf of the rat said, well, Your Honor, it was a group of rats. Surely more than one summons was required to notify all of the rat defendants. The court agreed, and the rats were acquitted. The reason I like to begin this presentation with a discussion about the crazy notion of the criminal prosecution and capital punishment of animals is to highlight the fact that when we talk about animal rights, the concept of rights for animals is certainly not anathema to history, nor was the criminal prosecution of animals an aberration of history. We see that in Western civilization, animals did in fact receive legal protections through the due process of law. We know that Jeremy Bentham, the great moral philosopher, has repeatedly brought up the question of animal rights by raising a fundamental question: why should the law refuse its protection to any sensitive being? And while nobody believes that animals today, nobody today truly believes that animals can form intent. And while nobody is suggesting that when we talk about animal rights, that animals should have the right to vote, that animals should have the right to bear arms, though certainly if animals had the right to bear arms, it would make hunting a lot more interesting. The question of animal rights remains: do animals deserve some legal protections from our system? And so let us explore this question of rights a little bit more deeply. So I like to begin my discussion of rights by asking students to consider a chair, right? Any discussion of rights begins with the concept of moral consideration. Moral consideration sounds complicated, but it's a rather straightforward idea. To what extent must we consider how our actions impact others? Moral consideration is the extent to which we must consider how our actions impact others. So here's a question. Take a chair. Do we owe any moral consideration to this chair? Must we concern ourselves with how our behavior impacts or affects this chair? The answer is clearly no. The chair doesn't care if I kick it, if I rock and lean back on its fragile hind legs. It doesn't care if I accidentally spill red wine on the fabric of the seat of the chair. It doesn't care, and I therefore owe this chair no moral consideration. It cares not what I do with it. It cares not how I treat it. Fair enough. But what about a person sitting in the chair? Do I owe this person any moral consideration? The answer is clearly yes, but why? Why do I not owe the chair moral consideration, but I owe a person sitting in the chair moral consideration? The answer is obvious, because the person cares how it's treated. In other words, the person has what we call interests. And by interests, we could say preferences. The person would prefer one type of treatment over another. Now, when a person is sitting in the chair, do I now owe the chair any moral consideration? Well, the answer is still no. If I have to be careful about my treatment toward the chair, it's actually in deference to the owner of the chair who's sitting in it. So when I am careful how I interact with that chair, it's not out of concern for the chair, but again, out of concern for the chair's owner. All right, so we see a clear distinction between a chair, which has no preferences, which has no interests, which cares not how it's treated, and a person sitting in the chair. So let's delve further. What about a cat sitting on a chair? Now, I certainly hope everybody believes that this cat deserves moral consideration, because this cat happens to be quite special. What about a cat sitting on a chair? Does this cat deserve my moral consideration? Must I consider how my actions impact that cat? If the answer is yes, then an obvious next question is why? Why must I consider how my behavior impacts that cat? Are we suggesting, and this is crucial, it may sound elementary, it may sound rather simple, but we're leading somewhere. Are we suggesting that a cat is somehow fundamentally different from a chair? Let's delve deeper still. Let's take a cup. I've got my little coffee cup here. It's fantastic. Nice hot pink. The color alone wakes me up in the morning. What is the value of a cup? Now, again, that sounds like a simple question. If I drink this coffee from the cup has value to me only to the extent that is able to perform its primary function, which is to retain, to hold liquid. But what if the cup, the mug, has a crack or springs a leak? Do I hold on to the mug and say, well, I should really hold on to it because after all, it is a mug? No, we throw it out, we discard it. In other words, we could say that this cup, this mug, only has instrumental value to us. That is, the cup is simply a means to an end. We care about the cup, we value the cup only to the extent that it provides us a means to an end. And in the morning with a cup of coffee, that's a very important end. All right. Now we could take the value of a human. And to understand the value of a human, I like to turn to one of my favorite Twilight Zone episodes. It wasn't one of the classic Twilight Zone episodes. It was actually one of the newer ones adapted from a great short story by Richard Matheson and turned into a movie titled The Box. Maybe some of you are familiar with this story. You've got a couple, they're financially struggling. They're sitting at the kitchen table, going over their bills, wondering how they're going to put food on the table, how they're going to pay their mortgage. All of a sudden, there's a knock at the door. They open the door, and an Ed McMahon type character is at the door saying, "Congratulations, you've won a chance to win $1 million. And the couple don't understand. They don't remember entering any sweepstakes, but the Ed McMahon-like character assures them, not to worry, you have a chance to win $1 million. You're on our list of people who can really use a financial break, and so here I am." They invite him in. He sits down. He's got a briefcase. He opens up the briefcase and presents this family, this couple, with a box. It's simply a black box with a red button on the top. The man says, "You have a chance to win $1 million. All you got to do is push the red button on the top of the box, and you will receive $1 million. No questions asked, tax-free, to spend however you wish." And the couple doesn't understand. Wait a second, you'll give us $1 million tax-free in cash, and all we have to do is push this red button? There's got to be some catch. The man says, "Well, there is one thing. If you push the red button, someone somewhere that you would have never met, you would have never crossed paths with, will die." The couple says, "Excuse me? All we have to do is push that red button. We get $1 million cash, but someone we would have never met, would have never crossed paths with, will die?" The man says, "Yes." He says, "I know there's a tough decision to make, so we give people 1 week to consider the question. And I'll leave the red box with you. I'll be back in a week, but if you push the red button before then, I'll know, I'll come by, I'll hand you a briefcase with the cash, I'll take the box, and our transaction will be done." And the family has to decide, do they push the red button and kill a stranger, or do they choose not to? Now, the ending is, of course, a fantastic Twilight Zone ending, and I would be cruel not to tell you how the story actually ends, so I will, but that's rather beside the point. Of course, they push the button. You have to have that kind of conflict, and you have to have that drama. So they push the button, and then there's a knock on the door. They open the door. There's the Ed McMahon-like character. He hands them bouquet of balloons, as well as a briefcase filled with $1 million cash. He then takes the box from them and bids them farewell. And as he's walking down the driveway, they say, "Well, wait, now what happens?" And the man says, "Well, now I go to the next winner, but don't worry, it's someone you've never met before and someone whose paths you would never have crossed." And of course, there's the chilling Twilight Zone type ending. What's interesting is that this little mind game, this little moral dilemma, teaches us the difference between instrumental value, a means to an end, and intrinsic value, having value simply for existing. When I ask my students, and I think if I were to ask the members of this Zoom, would you push the button? Most people, hopefully most people, would say no. But if questioned why not, You'd never meet this person. This person would never be a family member, would never be a business associate, would be a lover, would never anything. People would say, yes, but it's a human. A human, you can't kill a human. A stranger still has value. And that's what we mean when we talk about intrinsic value. Intrinsic value is having value or worth simply for existing. And so while a cup only has value so long as it fulfills some function for us, so long as it's a means to an end, we tend to view humans as being more than just a cup. We tend to view humans as having intrinsic value, value simply for existing. Now, it doesn't have to be a human. Many of us value nature, right? We want to protect the Arctic from drilling. We know that it could provide us a means to an end, fuel, but we believe that there are things that simply have value for existing. Okay, well, now let's go back to the cat. Is the cat more like a cup, or is the cat more like a human? That is, do we feel that that cat simply has instrumental value, companionship, affection, waking you up at 3 in the morning when it walks all over you? Or is the cat, is this a cat more like a cup, simply a means to an end? Or does the cat have value simply for existing? I think many of us who are dog and cat lovers would say that the cat is quite unlike a cup, that the cat has some level of intrinsic value, and that cat has some inherent worth. All right. What about a fish? What about a rat? Well, all of these questions are important because legally, animals are treated like the cup and the chair, not like a human. In fact, animals are treated as property under the law. There are virtually no federal laws. There are virtually no federal laws protecting animals that we tend to feel have instrumental value to us, right? So the Animal Welfare Act, which is supposed to regulate the treatment of animals used in commerce, on farms, in laboratories, what have you. The Animal Welfare Act excludes birds, that is chicken and turkeys, horses, mice, reptiles, amphibians, and all farm animals. In other words, the Animal Welfare Act excludes all of the animals that we typically use for some instrumental purpose, for science, for food, for clothing, entertainment, whatever it might be. Similarly, the federal government's Humane Slaughter Act does not view chickens or turkey as animals. Legally, they are not considered animals, and therefore the number is actually higher than 8 billion. We now consume and slaughter 10 billion animals a year, but the number is a couple of years old. So the Humane Slaughter Act would exclude some 8 billion of the 8.3 billion animals that we slaughter every year. So the federal government essentially does not have any animal welfare laws that have any teeth on the books. Meanwhile, state anti-cruelty laws are really not much better. They exempt animals used for commercial purposes. In other words, farm animals are largely exempt from state anti-cruelty laws. Now, states can choose to incorporate more laws regulating the treatment of animals. California is certainly one. We've had Proposition 2 and others that make sure that animals have enough room to turn around or spread its wings or things of that nature. But by and large, the majority of the states' anti-cruelty laws exempt any regulation of animals used for commercial purposes. And so therefore, most of the animals that we depend on for food, for medicine, for clothing, receive no moral consideration. They are, for all intents and purposes, the chair, the cup. Now, just to give you a case study of how truthful this is, we need to go back to 1997. Now, this is an old case, and I'm sure that Iowa's law has been updated since then, but it's a case worth repeating because it still shows that fundamental tenet of the law that animals are indeed property. However, minor changes to the law have occurred since then. It's a terrible case. In 1997, two teens, they were 18 years old, broke into an animal shelter in Iowa with baseball bats, and they bludgeoned 16 sheltered cats to death. Why? Who knows? What motivates an individual to do that? I've been a criminologist my whole life, or at least my whole professional life, and I couldn't begin to try to explain how that happens or why. But these two young men admitted to breaking into the animal shelter and beating 16 cats to death with baseball bats. When their defense counsel pled their case, the defense counsel stated that it shouldn't be a felony because these are, after all, stray cats. Stray cats means that nobody owns them. If nobody owns them, therefore, they have no commercial value. In fact, the defense argued that the cats are worth no more than $31.25 each, or the cost of the vaccinations and the paper processing fees. The jury took 2 hours and found the men guilty, not of animal cruelty. The jury agreed that these animals had no market value, and therefore the boys, the 18-year-olds, were found guilty of a crime against the shelter itself, not the animals within it. The 18-year-olds were found guilty of criminal trespass. The defense attorney stated simply, there's no market for adult cats. And so this is a perfect example of how animals are essentially property under the law. And so this is a fundamental problem. If we believe that a cat or a bird is more like a human than a piece of furniture, then we are on our way to becoming animal rights activists, because a right is a legal claim, and it's a legal claim to have protection. We provide moral consideration with any being that has an interest. Interests are things that deserve to be protected, and we protect people's interests through rights. So if a being has interests, those interests deserve to be protected. And most people believe that animals, whether a dog or a fish, have interests. Well, what should matter for rights? What should matter for moral consideration? This has been a question that has plagued philosophers throughout history. One argument put forward by Aristotle is that what matters for moral consideration is reason or rationality. Beings deserve our moral consideration if they are capable of rational thinking. Well, that excludes a large percentage of our population today, perhaps. But Aristotle was serious. He argued that what separates humans from everything else is reason and rationality, and that should be the dividing line between moral consideration and therefore rights and no rights. Of course, Aristotle never explains why rationality, and only rationality, should be the deciding factor in moral consideration. And it's worth noting that Aristotle did not believe women were capable of rationality, and therefore women were not deserving of rights. And so most people throughout history have rejected Aristotle's view that beings that are rational and only beings that are rational are deserving of rights. A second argument for who or what deserves rights is the argument of the social contract. A social contract is a creation of a moral community. It's an agreement to live according to a set of values and norms and behaviors. Well, the argument goes, we must have moral consideration for other members of this social contract. We must have moral consideration for members of our moral community that we've created. We certainly haven't entered into a moral or social contract with animals. Therefore, we don't owe animals any moral consideration. When I'm out in the woods and I confront a bear, I guarantee you that bear is not going to have any moral consideration for me because the bear knows nothing of the social contract and feels no obligation to behave with me in any particular way. So why should we as humans provide animals with any moral consideration? We need only provide moral consideration to other humans who have entered into this moral and social agreement. Well, that sounds like a strong argument for deciding who or what deserves rights and who can be denied rights, except for the fact that there's nothing that says we cannot choose to extend the social contract to beings that haven't deliberately entered into it. If we want to be honest, who among us has actually agreed to this social contract? We're all born into a society and handed a contract that we're told we've pretty much already signed simply because of our existence. Now we get to vote on it and tinker with it, but the framework has been there from the get-go. Not only that, there are lots of members of our society that haven't really agreed to a social contract. Certainly, we give moral consideration and rights to juveniles who haven't yet voted. We give moral consideration to babies, to the mentally infirmed. And we as a society choose to give moral consideration to members of other societies with their own moral and social contracts. So the idea that we must only provide consideration and therefore rights to members of our own moral community seems short-sighted. Finally, people use the Darwinian model of evolution to justify denying certain beings' rights. The argument is that humans are somehow hierarchically at the top of the animal kingdom, and therefore, by being hierarchically at the top, that gives us the right to treat other lesser beings, quote unquote, as we wish. The problem is that Darwin never talked about a hierarchy. We often hear a food chain. Darwin never talked about a food chain. In fact, Darwin described evolution as a tree, where it's just simply different branches, and humans happen to be on one branch, and all the different animals are on other branches. Moreover, I like to remind my students about the food chain by asking them to go jump in the ocean without a boat, without a life vest, and wait and see how long that human is at the top of the evolutionary chain, or in fact, the food chain. And of course, finally, humans have only been on the earth for a fraction of the earth's existence. Animals have been here far longer than humans, and as humans are very, very quickly destroying our own possibility of future existence, it is quite likely that cockroaches and rats will emerge as the top of the survival instinct, if you will. And so when we look at the question of who or what is deserving of moral consideration and therefore rights, all of the arguments we've put forward so far seem to fail. We recognize that animals are different from furniture, but we also recognize, as Aristotle did, that animals are different from humans. Humans have the capacity for reason, but that alone is not good enough to exclude animals from the moral community. Likewise with the social contract, likewise with the flawed argument about evolution. So then what truly separates animals from furniture, and what makes animals similar to humans, who of course are animals ourselves? what makes animals more similar to humans than furniture? The answer, of course, is sentience. Sentience is simply the ability to perceive, to have sensations, to have interests, to experience feelings of pleasure and pain, and to have preferences. An animal would prefer to be treated kindly than unkindly. An animal would prefer to be treated with love than with injury. Returning to Jeremy Bentham, his very famous utilitarian theory, his principles of morals and legislation, Jeremy Bentham wrote in 1781, with regard to animals, the question is not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? And if a being is capable of suffering, there is no morally defensible reason to deny that being legal protections from suffering. Interestingly, Jeremy Bentham wasn't writing about animals when he wrote this. He was writing about slaves. And he was trying to make the case that slavery was immoral. He added a footnote, and this quote was actually a footnote where he extended the moral defense of ending slavery with the moral justification for granting animals rights or legal protections. And so the formula then for rights is very straightforward. If a being is sentient, that being has interests, it has preferences. If a being has interests or preferences, those interests deserve to be protected through a right, because a right is a claim to something that deserves to be protected. Therefore, if a being, like an animal, is sentient, that being deserves rights. That doesn't mean the same rights. We don't grant juveniles the same rights as adults, but they deserve to be treated as more than simply property. And so when I teach my class, students are often surprised to find out that the animal rights movement is not quite what it's portrayed as in the news. Not everybody is a fan of PETA, and not everybody is really taking it to the furthest extremes that we often hear about. But when we think about it and we see the basic argument, most people, in fact, are animal rights activists to an extent. The question then becomes not whether animals deserve legal protections, but how much legal protection. All right, let us quickly turn to the second point that my course tries to make, the second learning objective, and that is by studying animals, we examine human relationships and, in fact, human biases. And this is one of my favorite parts of the class, and students tend to really like it. We know that our relationship with animals teaches a lot about human thinking patterns, human thought patterns, and human biases. Most people know intuitively that what happens to animals on factory farms, what happens to animals in laboratories is disheartening. And yet we know that humans have a capacity to dissociate ourselves from facts, from information that conflicts with our own moral sensibilities. Members of my family know my views on animals, and yet they just demand that I not talk about it because it will ruin their next meal. Again, they understand, but they choose not to know. Sometimes we believe that we're on the side of right, even though our behaviors suggest otherwise. So there was a survey given to 300 university students that asked a series of questions about animals. One, the students were asked to agree or disagree to a series of statements. One was force feeding geese to make their liver swell to produce pate. I'm talking, of course, about foie gras. Force feeding geese to make their livers swell to produce food is wrong. Approximately 75% of respondents agreed. But a subsequent question in the survey said, eating pate produced by the force feeding of geese is wrong. Here, a majority disagreed. And here we see a clear dissociation. If it's wrong to force feed geese to make food, why is it okay to eat food that is the result of force feeding geese? Now, perhaps the question should have been knowingly, right? Perhaps the survey designers should have said, eating pate knowingly produced by the force feeding. But again, we know that that word probably wouldn't have made a difference because, as stated, we all kind of know that cruelty goes into the making of food that we consume each and every day. Moreover, I've spared all of you some of the graphic video clips and photos that we see in my class. Students see it, and then they write their papers stating that they're still going to continue with their current practices, even though they're morally conflicted. What's interesting about our process of deliberately creating dissociation when facts conflict with our moral sensibilities doesn't just apply to animals. As a criminal justice professor, I like to use criminal justice examples. And so I talk about the death penalty. I ask my students to raise their hands and to tell me how many of them support the death penalty. And many students raise their hands. I then ask them how many would be willing to push the syringe that provides the lethal injection. Most of the students who previously raised their hands put their hands down. And when I ask why, they struggle to come up with a reason. If you support the death penalty, then you support the death penalty. If you're not willing to do it yourself, but you're simply passing the responsibility onto someone else, then your mind is creating that dissociation where you convince yourself that you're not the person really killing them, it's the state. And that's not an argument for or against the death penalty. It's merely an example of showing that kind of dissociation that all of us experience. And there was a very famous case, maybe not so famous, in the 1990s, KQED, the PBS station in San Francisco, was choosing, they were doing a full documentary series on California's death penalty. The moratorium on the death penalty had ended, and California was set to execute its first inmate in some 25 years, a man by the name of Robert Alton Harris. Since KQED was already producing this documentary on the death penalty, and since the execution was scheduled to take place during the production of this documentary, the producers sought permission to film the first execution to take place in the state of California in 25 years. Of course, San Quentin officials said no, and so KQED sued on free speech grounds. Now, what's interesting about this case is that it does show the machinations of dissociation. The public was divided on whether this execution should be televised, whether people had a right to know. But the public their views were the opposite of what we would expect. People who supported the death penalty did not want it televised. People who were opposed to the death penalty did want it televised. Both sides knew that the televising of a death penalty would break that dissociation that we all have with what our tax dollars actually do. A second element that the study of animals teaches us about ourselves has to do with out-group bias. And this research is quite interesting, but perhaps sadly not too surprising. Researchers created scenarios where an individual asks for help, either to change a tire or they're asking for money. It doesn't really matter what the offer for help is. But an individual asks passersby for help. And the key variable that was manipulated was who is the person asking for help. Well, the study results found that people are more likely to offer a stranger help when the stranger is an in-group member. In other words, white people were more likely to provide help to someone who was white and asking for help. African Americans were more likely to offer help to someone who was African American and requesting help. But it wasn't just race, it also applied to social class. When someone was dressed as a hippie, business people refused to offer help. When the person asking for help was wearing a business suit, people were more likely to offer help. And they manipulated this with a whole host of variables, and it is quite remarkable to see. Well, this is the phenomenon known as outgroup bias. Humans are more likely to grant moral consideration to beings that are more similar to humans, and less likely to grant moral consideration to beings that less resemble humans. Let's recall the letter to the editor of the National Geographic, where the person praised National Geographic for using the word murder, because after all, the gorillas so closely resemble humans. And again, we can look through history and see that outgroup bias has led to racism, sexism, nationalism, homophobia, Islamophobia, and all of the other discriminatory isms where we divide people into in-group and out-group membership. And then finally, on these social psychological variables, we could take a look at the concept of the similarity principle. Studies show that the public has more support for endangered species when the species more closely resembles humans. And the public erroneously believes that some animals more closely resemble humans than others, and therefore is willing to grant them endangered species status and therefore protection, even though the public's estimation of which animals are closer to humans than those that are dissimilar tends to be erroneous. There are surveys that ask members of the public to rank which animals are more capable of experiencing pain and which animals are less capable of experiencing pain. Of course, there's nothing in the literature that suggests that sentient animals or that sentience itself occurs on a continuum, where some animals or people experience more pain and others less pain, or more joy or less joy. And yet, this was the argument that was used to justify slavery, where slave owners tried to make the case that Africans did not experience pain the same way that non-Africans did, and that their threshold for pain was in fact greater. Well, the similarity principle doesn't just apply, as stated, to animals. We know that our criminal justice system operates according to the similarity principle. White judges and white juries tend to be more punitive and provide longer sentences when the victim is also white. Less punitive, less convictions, shorter sentences when the judge and the jury are white and the victim is non-white. And so we see through the study of animals actually a lot about our human relationships and our cultural biases. And then finally, we could look at the third learning objective, which is by studying animals, we begin to examine issues of gender, race, class, and power in society. This is the one that is often most revealing to students. When we think of animal cruelty, we tend to conceptualize it as an individualistic indicator of psychopathy. That is, we constantly hear about the serial killer, who experimented on animals before turning to humans. We hear of individuals who, as children, abuse animals and they grow up to do horrible things toward other humans. We tend to think of those people as simply having individual psychopathy. When we study animal cruelty, we begin to see trends that fall along social demographics. We know, for example, that a link exists among various pathologies, with animal cruelty present in all of them. So we have to use the word link because we haven't been able to establish correlation. We haven't been able to establish causation. We only establish correlation. We know that when we see domestic violence, it is likely we also see animal cruelty. We know that when we see child abuse, we often see animal cruelty. And so studies have shown, there's a study that my students read. Researchers looked at violent criminals, nonviolent criminals, and a control group of people in the general public. The survey asked these individuals to self-report any instances where they performed acts of animal cruelty during childhood. Now, when we talk about animal cruelty, we're talking about things that you really don't need to hear about, but very, very cruel, aberrant behavior. Lots of people poured salt on snails or took the wings off of flies or things of that nature. We're talking about horrific things. Well, the results of this study are quite shocking, but perhaps not surprising. 25% of the violent criminals reported having engaged in 5 or more acts of repeated animal cruelty during childhood. And when I say 5 or more, some individuals reported 10, 20, and so forth. It was 5 into infinity. 25% of violent criminals reported repeated acts of animal cruelty during childhood. That compares to only 5% of the nonviolent criminals, and not one member of the general public admitted to engaging in 5 or more acts of animal cruelty during childhood. Interestingly, the violent criminals were also more likely to report having been victims of child abuse during childhood. And when the researchers asked all of the individuals, the violent, the nonviolent criminals, and the general public, why they engaged in animal cruelty, we begin to learn a lot about human behavior. Their motive, they stated, was to assert power, control, and dominance over another living being. We know that when there's domestic violence, there's animal cruelty. Studies have shown, there was one particular study, perhaps the best study, it was an Australian study, 40% of women in shelters for victims of domestic violence. We know that 40% stated that their partner had threatened to harm or kill the pet prior to them seeking shelter at a women's shelter. That is compared to 6% of women not in a shelter for domestic violence. 40% of shelter women stated that their partner threatened to harm or kill the pet before they sought shelter, compared to 6%. 17% of the women in shelters stated that, in fact, their partner had followed through and killed the pet prior to them seeking shelter. So we see that in cases of domestic violence, we see that gender is fundamentally at play, since most of the instances of animal cruelty, as we'll learn, are overwhelmingly male behavior. Males use the animal as a surrogate for their partner. They use the animal as instrumental value. They use the animal as a means to an end, and the end is to dominate and control their partner. And the message is very clear. You are next. This is what will happen to you if you fail to comply with me. We know that Children identified as having disruptive behavior or behavioral problems are more likely to self-report having engaged in acts of animal cruelty. What we don't know is which of these things came first. Were the children treated harshly because they were abusing animals and the parents didn't know what to do? Or were the children, did the child abuse lead to the acts of animal cruelty? Again, the research is correlation only, but we could pretty much use our imaginations to figure out the causal order of these behaviors. What we see then is that animal cruelty is not simply individual pathology. Animal cruelty is a social phenomenon, and it takes place in the context of human interaction and human relationships. We know that victims of animal cruelty, the animal victims, have the same victimology as humans. Both are incredibly dependent on another living being for food, shelter, and healthcare. They're both incredibly vulnerable, and they're both incredibly trusting. And those who would abuse animals and those who would abuse humans are looking for the same characteristics in their victims. We know that animal cruelty, as well as other crimes against humans, are all about power, control, and domination. We know that animal cruelty, as well as violent crime in general, is overwhelmingly male behavior. 97% of reported of those accused of animal cruelty are male, with the majority being female complainants. Interestingly, and we could talk about this during Q&A if people want, the one crime that is overwhelmingly performed by females, and I use the word crime in quotes, is animal hoarding. What's interesting is that hoarding is less a crime than a result of a deep mental illness. The women who engage in animal hoarding are often suffering from such delusions that they continue to put food out for animal carcasses that have been in their home and in their presence for months, if not years. So they clearly are unaware of what they're doing, and since they don't quite have the guilty mind, I'm hesitant to use the word perpetrator or criminal. When it comes to acts of violence, the perpetrators are overwhelmingly male. When it comes to acts of nurturing another living being, the perpetrators, if you will, are overwhelmingly female. Finally, we see that animal cruelty is disproportionately performed by members of the lower socioeconomic status, but I question this finding and wonder whether this is in fact a cultural bias. We know that there are cultural biases in terms of non-animal cruelty crimes, and we can see the same when it comes to acts of animal cruelty. And so I will conclude by pointing out that the idea of learning about justice and morality and respect for other life and learning about ourselves and our own biases by turning to animals is really nothing new, right? We all entered life learning about morality, learning about ourselves, and of course, learning about justice through anthropomorphized animals. From fairy tales to computer animated Disney films, we have always learned about the human condition by studying animal behavior. And so I tell my students at the end of each class that the biggest mistake a student in my class could make is to think that it's merely a class about animals. I know I covered a lot. I hope it was clear. It's always weird talking to a screen when you don't actually see people. So I'm happy to open it up and have some really interesting, lively discussion. And I thank you all so much.
Thank you, Jarrett. And we have the first question from Marilyn Wasserman. Marilyn?
Yes, thank you, Professor. It was a very fascinating lecture. I would suggest, however, that there is a hierarchy in terms of animals versus humans. For example, suppose I have a cat. I've had that cat for 5 years. I dearly love that cat. And into my household, a child is born who turns out, after examination by doctors, to be allergic to cats. I wouldn't hesitate to get rid of that cat. Now, I will try to rehome that cat. I will try to find an animal shelter for that cat. If all else fails, I'll take it down to the animal shelter. But the life and health of my infant is more important to me than the life and sensitivity of that cat. Also, should my house be invaded by rats, I wouldn't hesitate to have them completely exterminated. So, what I'm suggesting is that there is a hierarchy in terms of the importance of the animal life to the human life. Okay. And in terms of your statement about the death penalty, I think it comes down to who's being killed. There are very few Jews who would have protested the execution in the state of Israel of Adolf Eichmann, and probably many of us would have plunged that the injection directly into his heart for what he did to us and our families. Thank you.
Great comments, and let me state on all of them that I agree completely. One of the problems with taking a 15-week class and condensing it into an hour and 15 minutes is that a lot of the minutia gets lost. So the most important word that my students learn for this whole topic is the word necessary. And the question we have to ask ourselves isn't whether to view animals as instrumental versus intrinsic, but to see whether our treatment of animals is in fact necessary or unnecessary. So I completely agree, right? If someone brings in a pet to the family and a member of the family is allergic, of course you're going to prioritize the human over the animal. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing immoral about that. The same way you would prioritize a human family member over a human stranger, right? We all have priorities and we all have preferences. I'm simply suggesting, and the animal rights movement is simply suggesting, that we provide animals with equal consideration. My cat, the one that you saw sitting on I didn't adopt that cat adopted me. And I mean that. I know we see those, bumper stickers, who rescued who, which always bugs me because it should be who rescued whom, but that's okay. Right? This cat was a stray, and I saw him wandering the streets, and he had no collar, and he came into my house, and when he realized there was a doggy door, he kept coming and going, and it's been months later and our cat is still with us. When we took him to the vet, he did in fact have a chip. We tried to contact the people who had the chip and we couldn't track down that person, and so it appears that the person just abandoned their animal. That's what I'm talking about, and that's what the movement is talking about. But again, if I was dying and I had to donate one of my organs to either a family member or a stranger, I would of course prioritize a family member. And I think the same applies to our relationship with animals, right? So it's not about, there isn't a hierarchy. It's about thinking it through before automatically categorizing humans versus animals. The second point, absolutely. I think many people would pull the trigger or push the syringe, whether it was a war criminal, a Nazi criminal, or someone like Robert Alton Harris. What I think, though, is that if we really stopped and think about most of the cases, we would be hesitant because we think one thing, but carrying out the behavior is a bit different. So I agree with you. I think we could all come up with exceptions, but the question forces us to no longer dissociate. And I think that that's the point I'm trying to make.
Thank you so much, Jarrett. On behalf of Ollie and the audience, I think we're in agreement that we're very grateful that you're teaching our students.
Thank you so much. I really had a great time. And again, it's so nice to feel part of an academic community. I'm sitting behind this computer 6-8 hours a day, and this is my only interaction with an academic community, and it's frustrating. We all feel it.
Well, we value what you're doing, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
I would like to, in closing, remind our members that in 2 weeks, November 3rd, we have another lecture, Designing and Teaching Digital Content, presented by Cynthia Flores-Gautreaux. So be here at 10 o'clock. Again, our very sincere thank yous, Jarrett, and all the best of luck to you.